Picture this. Your alarm doesn't go off. Phone's dead. You reach for it, but it's just done. Blank. A brick.
Mm-hmm.
No news feed, no weather app, definitely no social media scrolling.
Right.
Getting to work, forget Google Maps, that grocery order you put in last night. Yeah, probably not showing up. It's a world where the internet just, poof, vanished. What does that actually feel like? That day, that week, the silence.
It's a really powerful thought experiment, isn't it? And it definitely pulls at something fundamental about how we live now.
Totally.
We lean on the internet for so much, often without even thinking about it. So based on these, fascinating sources you've pulled together, we're going to dive deep into exactly that scenario.
Mm-hmm.
A global internet shutdown.
Okay.
We'll look at, how plausible is it really? What could even cause something like that? And then what are the ripple effects, on our lives, on the big global systems we count on?
Exactly. Whether it's something you worry about or maybe it's just a kind of morbidly fascinating what if, understanding the weak points in our, super connected world is just crucial today. Helps you stay informed, right?
Definitely.
And our sources, they give a pretty wide view. They cover everything from, the immediate hassle in our daily routines to the huge economic shockwaves, the pressure on governments, on infrastructure.
Social impacts to psychological ones.
Right, those two. And even the potential sort of long-term changes in how we even think about technology. So our mission really is to unpack what these sources are telling us. How could a global shutdown realistically happen, and what would the fallout actually look like?
Okay, so let's start with the big one. Can someone actually just flip a switch and turn off the whole internet globally?
The ultimate off button. Does it exist?
Well, the short answer, and maybe this is a bit comforting, is probably not. A complete, instant, worldwide shutdown. It's incredibly hard to pull off.
Right.
Think about trying to, stop every single river on Earth at the exact same moment.
Yeah, okay, good analogy.
The internet isn't one single thing. It's this massive, sprawling, decentralized mess, almost. A web of interconnected networks run by tons of different groups, huge companies, governments, little ISPs, even individuals.
So no single point of failure, no central command, but, and this is where it gets, kind of concerning, while a total blackout might be unlikely, the sources are pretty clear that major disruptions, the kind that would feel like a global shutdown for most of us, that's much more possible.
That's the key distinction, yeah. It's not about cutting every wire. It's about hitting the critical spots, the linchpins holding it all together.
Okay, so what are those linchpins?
Well, the sources point to a few main ones. First, you've got the domain name system, the DNS servers. Think of them like the internet's phone book, or maybe address book is better.
Right, translates website names into numbers computers understand.
Exactly. You type in thedeepdive.com, your computer asks a DNS server, hey, where's that? The DNS gives it the numerical IP address. If those servers go down.
Doesn't matter if the connection's there, you can't find anything. Like all the street signs vanished overnight.
Precisely. Then there are Internet Exchange Points, or IXPs. These are like major intersections where different networks physically connect to swap traffic efficiently.
Okay.
Then, the big one physically, those undersea fiber optic cables. Something like 95% of all international data travels through them.
95%. Wow.
Yeah, it's huge. And finally, the big cloud providers think Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, so much of the internet, so many apps and services actually run on their infrastructure. Take them out, and huge chunks of the web go dark.
So hitting any of those DNS, IXPs, cables, cloud giants could cause massive widespread problems, even if the whole internet isn't technically off.
Absolutely. And the sources lay out some pretty plausible and, frankly, worrying ways this could happen, starting with cyber attacks.
The obvious one, maybe?
Yeah, and a major threat. Coordinated attacks aimed right at that core infrastructure. The sources talk about hitting DNS servers, like we mentioned, or messing with BGP routing.
BGP, Border Gateway Protocol. Remind us quickly what that does.
Sure. It's basically how routers on the internet talk to each other to figure out the best paths to send data. A BGP hijack is like someone feeding those routers bad directions.
So traffic gets lost or sent to the wrong place.
Exactly. Makes parts of the internet just disappear for users. And we've seen glimpses of this. Remember the 2016 DIN attack?
Vaguely, yeah. That was the Mirai botnet thing, right? Using hacked cameras and stuff.
That's the one. They flooded DIN, a major DNS provider, with traffic. It wasn't global, but it knocked out Twitter, Netflix, Reddit, a whole bunch of big names for hours. It showed how hitting one key player can have huge ripple effects.
Yeah, it really hammered home how fragile some of these central points are. Okay, so cyber attacks. What else? The sources mentioned solar storms. Sounds like sci-fi.
It does, but it's a real threat, a really severe geomagnetic storm, something like the Carrington event back in 1859.
Right, the one that set telegraph offices on fire.
Yeah. If something like that hit us today, with our reliance on electronics, it could potentially fry satellites, damage those undersea cables we talked about, and overload power grids. The impact on the internet backbone could be, well, catastrophic.
Wow. So, space weather is a genuine risk factor. Then there's the more down-to-earth threat.
Yeah.
Physical damage.
Yep. Those undersea cables, despite being, deep underwater, aren't invincible. Ship anchors dragging, underwater earthquakes, even deliberate sabotage.
Has that happened?
Oh, yeah. The sources mention the 2008 Mediterranean cable cuts. Several cables were severed, nobody's entirely sure how, maybe anchors, maybe something else, but it caused major internet slowdowns and outages across the Middle East and South Asia for weeks. Shows how vulnerable those physical links are, especially where they converge.
Okay. And then maybe the most deliberate threat, governments deciding to pull the plug.
Exactly. Now, usually this happens within a country's borders. The sources point out there were like 187 documented shutdowns by governments in 35 countries just in 2022.
That many? Why?
Often during protests, elections, political instability, trying to control information flow. The 2011 Egypt shutdown during the Arab Spring is a famous example. They just cut the country off.
Right.
The worry, though, is what happens in a major global conflict. Could multiple governments start cutting connections? There's no digital Geneva Convention stopping them. It could lead to a sort of patchwork, near global blackout.
The internet itself becoming a weapon, essentially. Okay, one last cause the sources mentioned. Something less dramatic, maybe. Software glitches.
Yeah, sounds mundane, but don't underestimate it. These systems are incredibly complex. One tiny mistake in a software update or a configuration file can cascade. Remember the Fastly outage in 2021?
Oh, yeah. Took down CNN, the New York Times, Amazon, loads of sites.
All from one customer changing a setting that triggered a bug in their software. And way back in 1997, a database error at Network Solutions, who handled domain names then, caused a big DNS outage. So yeah, simple errors can have massive consequences.
Okay, so it seems like while the big red button is fiction, there are definitely plausible paths. Cyber attacks, solar flares, physical damage, government action, even just bugs that could lead to a really serious, widespread internet disruption. Let's game that out then. It happens. What's day one like? What does daily life become?
Well, this is where you really feel it personally, right? The sources paint a picture of just immediate breakdown of routines, basic communication gone. Email, WhatsApp, Slack, social media, silence.
Trying to find your way somewhere.
GPS in your phone mostly stops working without the data connection for maps and traffic. Organizing your life. Digital calendars might be offline, cloud storage with your documents, photos, inaccessible.
It's like forced time travel. Suddenly it's 1995 again, but without the infrastructure we had back then. I mean, I barely remember how to use a paper map.
Exactly. And think about cities. Public transport relies heavily on envelope schedules, digital tickets, real-time updates. Those systems would likely seize up. The sources really highlight how fragile urban areas are because everything's so integrated online.
I read one bit about ride sharing, totally dependent on real-time location. Trying to find your Uber without the app updating. Forget it. Mass confusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this interesting potential generational split mentioned. Older people who remember life before the internet dominated everything.
I dust off the old address book and landline.
Possibly adapt a bit quicker, yeah. Younger generations who've never known a world without constant connectivity. That could be a much bigger shock, a steeper learning curve.
Just coordinating a simple meetup would be a nightmare. Phoning people, assuming landlines work, going to the bank for cash, queues would be insane, getting basic info. Library, maybe, if it's open. Our dependence is just total.
It really is. And that dependence immediately translates into, well, staggering economic consequences. That's another major focus in the sources.
Billions lost, I imagine.
Billions, potentially trillions, depending on the duration.
Yeah.
Online banking freezes. Stock markets halt trading. E-commerce just stops. Think about Amazon. The sources mention they pull in over $1 billion a day. Google, Meta, their ad revenue vanishes.
Supply chains, too, right? Everything's tracked online.
Totally. Just-in-time delivery systems would collapse. Remote work, impossible for millions. The sources cite this figure in 2022. Even just regional shutdowns cost the global economy nearly $24 billion. Scale that up globally.
Wow. That $24 billion is with mostly localized shutdowns, a global one. It's almost unthinkable.
And it hits sectors differently. Anything relying on that real-time data, global coordination, finance, logistics, they're incredibly vulnerable. It exposes the downside of hyper-efficiency built on constant connection.
But hang on, the sources did mention one tiny potential upside, didn't they, for some businesses?
Yeah, an interesting counterpoint. Small, local brick-and-mortar shops,
Yeah.
they might see a sudden surge in customers. If you can't order online, you have to go to the store down the street.
A forced return to local shopping, for a while anyway.
For a while,
Oh,
exactly. But then you hit another problem, the sources flag. How do people pay? We're so reliant on digital payments, cards, apps. A sudden shift back to cash. Our current infrastructure might not cope. ATMs would run dry fast.
it really throws into sharp relief how much basic infrastructure assumes the internet works, which, as the sources suggest, raises the question, would a crisis like this finally force governments and companies to build better offline backups or stronger hybrid systems?
It might have to.
Yeah.
Now, beyond the daily chaos and the economic meltdown, what about the really critical stuff? Government services, essential infrastructure.
Yeah, things like air traffic control, power grids, emergency services.
This is where it gets potentially really dangerous. Air traffic control is heavily digitized. Power grid monitoring needs constant data flow. Emergency dispatch systems rely on digital communication and location data. A major outage could severely impair all of that.
Crippling the systems designed to keep things running and keep people safe.
And there's a weird paradox with cybersecurity, too. Many security systems assume the internet is working to report threats, get updates, coordinate responses. If the net's down, how do you even detect or respond to certain kinds of attacks, physical or digital? You're flying blind.
That's terrifying. And the sources also mentioned the risk of just panic, misinformation.
Absolutely. With trusted online news sources gone, rumors could spread like wildfire through word of mouth or whatever limited communication exists. Fear, panic. It could escalate quickly.
And internationally.
Big problems. Military coordination, intelligence sharing, even basic diplomacy relies on secure digital channels now. Cutting those off could ratchet up tensions massively, especially in a crisis. Plus, ironically, all those digital surveillance systems, suddenly useless.
Like the whole digital world goes deaf and blind at once.
Okay, unsettling picture. What about us, the human side, socially, psychologically? What happens when the plug is pulled?
Well, the sources suggest it's complicated. On one hand, for many people used to being constantly connected, constantly stimulated, expect serious anxiety, frustration, maybe even withdrawal symptoms, that fire hose of information, social updates, entertainment, suddenly shut off.
Digital cold turkey. I can almost feel the phantom phone vibrations now. Right. But then the sources also float this counter idea. We talk about digital fatigue, right? Feeling overwhelmed by bad news, social media pressure, FOMO.
Yeah, definitely.
For some, could a forced disconnection actually be a relief, a temporary improvement in mental well-being? Less noise, less comparison, maybe more calm?
A giant enforced digital detox. That's a wild thought. But there's a flip side to that too, isn't there? People who depend on the internet for support.
Crucial point.
Yeah.
Online mental health services, support groups for specific conditions, people in isolated areas who rely on the net for community. For them, a shutdown isn't a detox, it's potentially devastating isolation, loss of vital resources.
This really cuts both ways. And what about like actual social interaction? Would we all suddenly start talking to our neighbors again?
The sources suggest maybe a potential resurgence of local community ties, families spending more time together. But, and it's a big but, that depends heavily on the situation. Is it safe outside? Do people have the time and resources? Or are they just scrambling to cope?
Right. Depends if it's just inconvenient or truly chaotic. Okay, so zooming out, long term. If this massive disruption happened, what are the lasting effects? Culturally, societally?
Well, the sources seem to agree it would be a watershed moment, historic. It would force a huge global conversation about digital resilience, about whether we've become too reliant on these systems.
A wake-up call.
Definitely. You might see pushes for, I don't know, encouraging regular digital detox periods, maybe even building mandatory offline capabilities into critical systems, just better preparing people and society for outages.
And maybe a renewed interest in older tech
Right.
or different kinds of tech.
Yeah, the sources touch on that. Maybe a boom in analog tools, physical books and records, but also maybe more focus on developing things like local mesh networks that don't need the global internet, or apps designed to work offline first.
Like the outage itself acts as this giant, painful stress test on the whole system.
Exactly. It would expose every weak point.
Right.
And that could spur investment in more robust, maybe more decentralized models. Things like satellite internet constellations, peer-to-peer networks that aren't so dependent on those central choke points.
It's strange to think this potentially awful event could actually lead to a stronger, maybe more balanced digital future.
It's possible.
Yeah.
But getting through the immediate chaos and the transition, that would be incredibly difficult, no doubt about it.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, the main takeaway from our sources seems to be this: a complete, sudden, turn off the whole world internet shutdown. Probably not going to happen like in the movies. The net's too decentralized.
Right.
But significant, widespread, debilitating disruptions, those are definitely plausible. Whether it's a massive cyber attack, a huge solar storm, physical damage, governments acting together in a crisis, or even just a critical software bug,
Mm-hmm.
the potential is there, and the effects would ripple through absolutely everything: our daily lives, the global economy, governments, our safety, even our mental state. Profound, far-reaching, cascading effects.
Which brings us to a key question for you, listening right now. Thinking about everything we've just discussed, the potential impacts on communication, work, daily tasks, getting information, just take a second. How much do you personally depend on the internet? How would a serious, prolonged outage affect your life right now?
And maybe one final thought to chew on, something the sources touch on from different angles. Could a major internet disruption, as scary as it sounds, actually end up being a catalyst? Could it force us to build more resilient, maybe more balanced ways of living, both online and off? Or would the immediate chaos, the economic disaster, the social breakdown just be too much? Is it a potential reset or just a straight-up dystopia? Something to think about.